The rain lashed against the smoked glass of the car, each drop a percussive reminder of the city's relentless pulse. Inside, Stephen Brooks, a man whose name was synonymous with steel and glass, felt nothing. Not the chill from the damp night, nor the tremors of the engine idling. He was a conqueror, his empire built on calculated ruthlessness, and tonight was merely another transaction. He was here to buy silence, to seal away the last echo of a past he wished to forget. He found her in a diner that smelled of stale coffee and forgotten dreams. A neon sign flickered erratically, casting her face in stark, intermittent light. She was older than he remembered, but her eyes held the same defiant spark. Not anger, which he could have crushed, but profound, unsettling indifference. "Natalie Brunson," he stated, his voice a low rumble accustomed to commanding boardrooms. She looked up, a half-eaten sandwich paused midway to her lips. Her gaze held no fear, no avarice. That was her first weapon. She didn't want his money. She simply looked through him, as if he were a pane of dirty window glass. "You have 10 seconds, she said, her voice raspy, tired, yet laced with unyielding strength. The diner clocks ticking suddenly seemed deafening. He opened his mouth, prepared to offer terms, but she cut him off, leaning forward slightly, her eyes locking onto his. "I didn't lose my job that day, Stephen. I lost the only person who believed I was worth more than the dirt on your shoes." The words weren't shouted. They were delivered like a quiet, precise surgical incision. They didn't scream for vengeance. They mourned truth. In that instant, the meticulously constructed walls around Stephen Brooks' heart didn't crumble, they imploded. He had come prepared for anger, for negotiation, for the cold calculus of transaction. What he got instead was a sentence that would haunt him, a truth that would unravel everything he thought he knew about the cost of his ambition. The rain outside amplified, and for the first time in decades, Stephen Brooks felt the ground shift beneath his feet. Stephen Brooks spent decades building an empire, only to realize he was standing on hollow ground. We all have costs we've ignored to get where we are. If this story hit a nerve, it's because you know that some things can't be bought, they can only be faced. Hit the subscribe button to join a community that explores the stories beneath the surface. And tell me in the comments, what was your Natalie moment, the time a single sentence changed how you saw your entire life? While you think about that, let's get back to the story. The polished black sedan pulled up to a forgotten street, its sleek lines jarring against the faded brick and peeling paint of the surrounding buildings. Stephen Brooks exited, the tailored fabric of his suit clinging slightly in the damp air. The rain, a fine mist now, clung to his dark hair like an unwelcome halo around his meticulously composed features. He found the diner precisely where his private investigator, Cale, had indicated. The daily grind, the neon sign declared in a tired, buzzing hum, missing a letter, making it the daily grin to anyone who cared to look closer. He pushed open the door, the bell above chiming a tinny welcome that felt entirely out of place for his grim mission. The aroma of stale coffee, burnt sugar, and something vaguely metallic, perhaps old grease, hit him first. It was the smell of working-class America, of struggle and perseverance, a world he had systematically erased from his consciousness decades ago. The space was sparse, a long counter with chipped laminate, a few worn booths with cracked red vinyl, and a scattering of patrons lost in their own quiet miseries. A trucker nursing black coffee. An elderly woman picking at pie. Lives Stephen Brooks would never understand. And there she was. Natalie Brunson. She sat alone in a booth by the window, her back mostly to him, her dark hair pulled back in a simple practical style. No expensive salon treatment, no carefully styled waves, just function over form. She wore a practical unassuming jacket, worn at the elbows, a far cry from the power suits he was accustomed to seeing on women in his world. The way she held her mug, cupping it with both hands as if drawing warmth from the ceramic, suggested a deep-seated chill that even the warm drink couldn't entirely banish. He walked towards her, each step echoing too loudly in the otherwise hushed diner. His Italian leather shoes clicked against the scuffed linoleum floor, announcing his wealth, his otherness. His presence, usually a gravitational force in any room, commanding attention, inspiring deference or fear, barely registered with her. When she finally turned, her dark eyes, deep and fathomless, met his without flinching. There was no flicker of recognition, no surprise, no anger. Just a profound, almost weary, indifference. It was a look that stripped him bare, robbing him of his usual advantage. He had anticipated many reactions during the drive here: confrontation, perhaps fury, maybe even tears. He'd expected demands, pleas for mercy, or the calculating greed of someone ready to squeeze him for every penny. What he got instead was a gaze that saw not the titan of industry, not the man whose net worth could buy small countries, but merely a man, ordinary, insignificant, and entirely irrelevant in the face of her quiet, immeasurable suffering. The anger, the fear, the desire for recompense, none of it was there. It was as if he were a ghost, an echo of a problem long since dealt with and dismissed, filed away in the dark recesses of painful memory. This wasn't a shakedown, it was an execution by apathy. His prepared statements, his carefully crafted offers of compensation drafted by his legal team, felt suddenly hollow, meaningless, almost insulting in their inadequacy. He, Stephen Brooks, the man who commanded billions with a word, who could make or break fortunes with a single phone call, was standing before a woman in a run-down diner who looked at him as if he were less than the dirt on his own expensive shoes. And in that moment, for the first time in a very long time, Stephen felt a cold, unfamiliar dread begin to coil in his gut like a living thing, squeezing the air from his lungs. The silence in the diner stretched between them, punctuated only by the clatter of a plate in the kitchen and the distant rumble of city traffic. Stephen, unaccustomed to being rendered speechless, felt unease prickle up his spine. He had anticipated many reactions from Natalie: fury he could negotiate, tears he could assuage with money, even vengeance he could counter with legal threats. But indifference? Indifference was a weapon he hadn't prepared for. He slid into the opposite side of her booth without invitation, worn vinyl groaning under his weight. The proximity brought a faint, clean scent, not expensive perfume, but something natural, like fresh rain and cold air mixed with laundry detergent. It was disarmingly honest. He cleared his throat, the sound rough and too loud. "Natalie, I believe we need to talk." Her gaze remained unwavering, emotionless. She set down her sandwich with deliberate care. "About what, Stephen?" Her voice was low, almost a murmur, yet it vibrated with unexpected depth, like a cello string plucked softly. "Not accusatory. Merely factual. About what happened. Your father. The company." He gestured vaguely, his usual precision failing him utterly. He meant to convey regret, offer veiled apology, pave the way for his financial offer. But the words felt clumsy, hollow approximations of actual human emotion. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through her. Her grip tightened on her mug, knuckles turning white. First real sign of life since he'd entered, and somehow it made everything worse. "My father was a good man, Stephen. A small business owner. He built his company from nothing, with his hands, with his integrity." She paused, eyes darkening not with rage, but profound, aching sorrow that seemed to fill the entire booth. He didn't deserve to be crushed by progress. The word dripped with bitter irony. Stephen shifted, suddenly aware of how his expensive suit must look here. "It was a corporate acquisition, Natalie. Standard procedure. We offered fair market value. Your father chose to fight it." Even as the words left his mouth, he heard the cold, detached corporate jargon, MBA speak reducing human lives to balance sheet line items, and for the first time in his career, it sounded utterly, irredeemably monstrous. She finally broke eye contact, gazing at rain streaking the window, each drop like a tear the building itself was crying. Fair market value for a lifetime of dreams? For a man's pride? For his reason to wake up every morning? She turned back slowly, eyes burning with sudden quiet intensity that pierced every layer of his carefully constructed composure. "You don't understand, do you? You never did." Then she leaned forward, just slightly, and delivered the words that would haunt every moment of his life from this point forward. "I didn't lose my job that day, Stephen. I lost the only person who believed I was worth more than the dirt on your shoes." The sentence was delivered with surgical precision, cutting through every defense, every rationalization, every carefully constructed lie he'd told himself about the cost of his ambition. Not a scream of anger he could dismiss as emotional overreaction, but a lament, a quiet statement of devastating fact laying bare the true cost of his empire building. It spoke of betrayal transcending mere financial ruin, of faith shattered, a human spirit trampled underfoot by his corporate machine's relentless, uncaring march. In that instant, the world tilted. The diner's din faded to nothing, rain outside roared like a tempest, fluorescent lights hummed with almost malevolent glare. He saw not a woman in a cheap booth, but a mirror reflecting the true monstrous cost of his success, a cost measured not in dollars or market share, but in broken hearts and shattered dreams. The cold steel heart he'd always prided himself on, the ruthless efficiency that built his empire, felt suddenly brittle, cracking under the weight of her simple, undeniable truth. He felt a phantom pain in his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced since childhood, since before he'd learned to bury emotion beneath layers of ambition and calculated risk. He thought he had come here to clean up a loose end, to buy silence, to neatly package away an unfortunate byproduct of necessary business. Instead, he had been handed a sentence, a life sentence, delivered with quiet dignity by the woman he had so carelessly, so utterly destroyed. And he had no defense, no appeal, no way to commute this judgment. He could only sit there in a worn diner booth, and feel the weight of what he'd done finally truly crash down upon him. The sleek black car felt like a gilded cage. Stephen leaned back against plush leather, city lights blurring into streaking neon tears. Natalie's words echoed relentlessly, "I lost the only person who believed I was worth more than the dirt on your shoes." His penthouse, that monument to power perched high above the city, offered no comfort. The panoramic windows mocked him. Each twinkling light below represented a cog in the machine that had ground Natalie's father, and her spirit, into dust. Sleep refused to come. The first night, he lay in his vast, empty bed while silence amplified her words. Every shadow coalesced into Natalie's weary figure, her devastating indifference stripping him bare. He saw his face reflected in dark glass, a stranger with sharp angles, and despised the cold efficiency it projected. By the second day, focus was impossible. Expensive scotch tasted like ash. Polished marble floors seemed to ripple beneath his feet. His assistant, Elara, noticed his pallor, the tremor in his hands. He dismissed her concerns sharply, but the effort exhausted him. Driven by desperate need, Stephen plunged into obsessive investigation. He locked himself in his office, monitors glowing, casting harsh blue light. He scoured documents from 3 years prior, a period he'd barely noticed, delegating such minor concerns to lieutenants. What he found chilled him. Initial offers to Mr. Brunson had been fair, even generous. But when the old man refused to sell, tactics escalated with methodical cruelty. Emails from his acquisitions head, Eric, detailed systematic pressure. Regulatory audits mysteriously triggered. Key suppliers dropped Brunson and Sons, citing strategic realignments Stephen now recognized as orchestrated intimidation. Bank credit squeezed through back-channel communications with institutions owing Brooks Corporation favors. None of it was technically illegal, that was the horrifying part. Just business, capitalism functioning as designed. But it was also suffocating strangulation, designed to break a man who wanted to preserve his legacy. He'd given no direct order. His directive had been broad: secure the acquisition, by any means necessary. He'd given them the leash, and Eric, eager to impress, had used it to systematically hang Mr. Brunson. Cold sweat beaded Stephen's brow reading Eric's memo. The old man is a sentimental fool clinging to outdated notions of craftsmanship. We'll make it economically untenable for him to exist. The casual cruelty, reducing a human life to an obstacle, made bile rise in his throat. Then, buried in archived correspondence, a letter from Natalie. A plea written not in legal language, but raw, desperate words of a daughter watching her father die inside. She'd explained her father's failing health, the stress-induced heart condition, how he'd stopped sleeping, stopped eating. She described decades of hard work, integrity, a man who'd built something with his hands and heart. She'd humbly asked for mercy, for fair settlement, allowing her father to retire with dignity intact. The letter had been intercepted by his then-assistant Lyra, rerouted to Eric, who'd responded with curt, cold form letter rejection. Never forwarded to Stephen's desk. He'd never seen it. Never known it existed. Until now. Nausea washed over him. He'd been deliberately shielded from human cost, insulated by corporate bureaucracy from consequences of his ambitions. His subordinates, zealous to execute his will and advance their careers, had gone far beyond anything he'd sanctioned. But they'd acted in his name, believing they were fulfilling his unspoken desires for total victory. 72 hours without sleep. 72 hours watching his reality crumble. He saw Natalie's father's ghost everywhere now, not a faceless victim, but a real man. Hands scarred from honest labor. Eyes once alight with dreams, slowly dimming as Stephen's machine crushed everything he'd built. And he saw Natalie, young and vibrant, her spirit slowly, methodically eroded by forces Stephen commanded from his tower. The realization struck like a physical blow: he hadn't merely broken a soul. He'd built a system, a culture, an apparatus designed to break souls efficiently without his direct involvement. He'd allowed others, in his name, to systematically dissect a man's life. The man he'd thought he was, calculating but fair businessman who played by rules, was convenient fiction. He was responsible for all of it. Every squeeze of credit, every lost supplier, every sleepless night hastening Mr. Brunson's decline. And the guilt, raw and searing, finally began burning through the numbness encasing his heart for years. The world outside his gilded cage churned ceaselessly, but Stephen Brooks was trapped in personal hell, and the currency was his sanity. The invitation arrived 2 weeks after the diner, a stark white envelope with the Brooks Corporation insignia embossed in silver, gleaming under her kitchen's fluorescent light. Natalie stared at it, turning it over in her hands, bitter taste rising. Stephen Brooks. The name was an anathema, a curse word she'd trained herself not to speak aloud. Inside, an offer of reparations for past oversights, as if crushing her father's life was merely an accounting error. A contract for senior consultant in a community redevelopment initiative. The salary was astronomical, a number that made her dizzy. More than 5 years at her current data entry job, trapped in a windowless office inputting meaningless numbers. Her first instinct was visceral: tear it up, burn it, scatter the ashes. She wanted nothing from him, especially not his tainted money, his guilty conscience transformed into a paycheck. It felt like blood money. But then she looked at Julian. He sat hunched over a drawing pad at their second-hand kitchen table, movements slow and deliberate, each line requiring concentration that shouldn't be necessary for a 23-year-old. His face was pale, often etched with quiet pain he tried hiding but never quite succeeded. Julian, a brilliant aspiring architect whose sketches had once filled their apartment with dreams, had been diagnosed with rare aggressive autoimmune disease a year ago. The kind with a long Latin name that doctors delivered with sympathetic eyes and carefully neutral voices. Treatments were experimental, cutting-edge, expensive beyond reason. Her meager earnings barely covered basic medication that kept him stable, not the specialized therapies he desperately needed. She walked to him, gently touching his shoulder. He looked up, faint smile on his lips, eyes holding weariness far beyond his years. Eyes that had seen too many hospital waiting rooms, endured too many needle sticks. Just sketching a new kind of bridge, Nat, he whispered, voice soft, slightly hoarse from breathing treatments. One that doesn't break. That sentence echoed her father's shattered hopes, the way everything he'd built had crumbled under Stephen Brooks's corporate machinery. She felt tears prick her eyes but blinked them back. She couldn't refuse. Not for Julian. Her hatred for Stephen Brooks was a burning ember that would never extinguish, but her love for her brother was an inferno consuming everything else. She would walk through fire, even if that fire was Stephen Brooks himself, to give Julian a chance at life. That night, she told Julian about the offer. She didn't hide her conflicted feelings, the rage simmering beneath her skin, the sense of betrayal at even considering it, the desperate need for money. Julian, wise beyond his years and weakened by his condition, simply squeezed her hand with what little strength he had. Do what you need to do, Nat. I'll be okay either way. But they both knew that wasn't entirely true. She gave 2 weeks' notice the next morning. Her supervisor barely looked up from his computer screen. 3 weeks later, on a cold Monday morning that smelled of coming snow, Natalie walked into the gleaming Brooks Corporation building. Every surface gleamed with cold efficiency: polished marble, brushed steel, glass everywhere reflecting her small figure back in infinite regress. A stark contrast to the warmth she tried desperately to hold within. She was escorted to a vast, glass-walled office overlooking the sprawling city like a throne room surveying conquered kingdom. An office directly across from Stephen Brooks himself. Not reparations. Forced proximity designed to keep her within his orbit. Stephen met her at her office door, neutral expression carefully constructed, though his eyes flickered with something she couldn't decipher, apprehension, perhaps nascent guilt. Dark circles shadowed his eyes like bruises. He looked thinner, gaunt, as if guilt was physically consuming him. "Welcome, Natalie," he said, voice smoother, less arrogant than she remembered, yet still resonating with undeniable authority from decades of command. "I trust the terms are acceptable." She met his gaze head-on, chin tilted upward in unconscious defiance. "The terms are acceptable, Mr. Brooks. But don't mistake my presence for forgiveness." Her voice was steady, devoid of overt anger but firm as steel, each word carefully chosen. "I'm here for my brother. Not for you." She hated him. Hated the circumstances forcing her here. Hated how her heart twisted with conflicting emotions, rage and pragmatism and guilt, with every step deeper into his gilded cage. But she needed the money. For Julian. That was the only thing that mattered. Stephen merely nodded, shadow passing over his face like clouds covering the sun. He knew. He understood. This wasn't triumph, but another painful step in penance he was only beginning to comprehend. The forced proximity was as much torture for him as for her, a constant, living reminder of the soul he'd shattered and was now desperately, awkwardly, impossibly trying to mend. 3 weeks into her tenure, Natalie had carved out tenuous routine built on avoidance and careful boundaries. She arrived early, left late, spent days in meetings with genuine community leaders who actually understood displacement and gentrification. She avoided Stephen when possible, taking stairs when she saw him near elevators. The Community Redevelopment Initiative was still finding its footing, drowning in bureaucracy, but she was determined to make it mean something real. One evening, working late on a proposal to actually involve displaced residents in development decisions, she heard a soft knock. She looked up, expecting a Lara or another assistant. Instead, it was Julian. Her brother stood in the doorway, looking small despite his tall frame, clutching a large portfolio. His eyes were bright with rare excitement she hadn't seen in months. "Nat, I know you said not to visit, but I had to show you something." She rose quickly. "Jules, are you okay? Did you take your medication?" "I'm fine. Took a cab. The new meds are working better." He settled carefully, opening his portfolio with trembling fingers, revealing intricate architectural drawings. Bridges. Dozens of them. Fantastical structures defying physics, arching over impossible distances with elegant, organic curves. Some split into multiple paths. Others spiraled upward like DNA helixes. "I've been thinking about what you're doing here," Julian said softly. "I know you hate it. I know you're only here because of me." His voice held no guilt, just acceptance. "And I realized something while sketching." He pointed to one design, a bridge splitting into multiple paths before reconverging. A bridge isn't just about getting from one side to another. It's about bearing weight without breaking. About holding people up when they're crossing the hardest parts. Tears pricked Natalie's eyes. Her brilliant brother, wasting away, was still teaching her about hope. "You're building a bridge for me," he continued, voice cracking. "From dying to living. And maybe Mr. Brooks is trying to build one too. From who he was to who he wants to be. Even if he doesn't deserve to reach the other side." A voice came from the doorway, quiet and filled with wonder. "Your brother is a remarkable artist." Stephen Brooks stood there, presence diminished, almost hesitant. He must have been walking past, heard voices. His eyes were fixed on Julian's drawings with an expression Natalie had never seen, genuine wonder tinged with profound sadness. "Mr. Brooks," Julian said simply. Stephen stepped in slowly, movements careful. "May I?" Julian nodded. Stephen leaned over the portfolio, studying each bridge with intense focus. At the one Julian had described, he went very still. I had a teacher once, Stephen said quietly, voice stripped of authority. An old craftsman at my boarding school. I was 12, angry because my father had just died. This man, Mr. Chen, showed me how to build things with my hands, find peace in creation rather than destruction. He looked at Julian directly. He said the strongest structures aren't ones that never bend. They flex with weight, distribute pressure across multiple points, understand stress and work with it. His jaw tightened. I forgot that. I built an empire on rigid steel and unforgiving glass. When your father pushed back, I crushed him instead of finding a way to bear the weight together. The raw honesty shocked Natalie. This wasn't rehearsed apology. This was confession, pulled from somewhere deep and broken. Julian asked directly, "Do you wish you could build it differently?" Stephen's eyes moved from Julian to Natalie and back. Every single sleepless night. Uncomfortable silence settled. Julian gathered his drawings. I should go. I'll catch a cab. I have a car downstairs, Stephen said gently. My driver can take you home. Please. Not a command. A request. Almost a plea. Julian looked at Natalie, who nodded barely perceptibly. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Brooks. After Julian left, Natalie and Stephen stood in her office, silence heavy. Finally, Stephen spoke, barely above a whisper. He's dying, isn't he? Natalie's throat constricted. The treatments are helping. He has time. Time to build more bridges. Time you're buying with money from the man who destroyed your father's dreams. He looked haunted. The irony is exquisite. And deserved. For the first time, Natalie saw not the monster who'd shattered her world, but a man genuinely reckoning with cost of his choices. A man who understood some bridges, once burned, could never be rebuilt, only mourned. 2 months into Natalie's tenure, the annual gala arrived with all the inevitability of a thunderstorm. Held in the city's most exclusive ballroom, it dripped with old money and new excess. Crystal chandeliers the size of compact cars, marble floors polished to mirror shine, walls adorned with contemporary art costing more than most people's houses. Stephen had insisted on her attendance, citing the initiative and the need to meet potential partners. Natalie knew it was another form of calculated control, further integrating her into his world. She wore a simple black dress bought with her first paycheck, practical, understated, quiet rebellion against shimmering excess. Compared to other women in designer gowns with price tags that could fund Julian's treatments for a year, she felt like a sparrow among peacocks. Stephen moved through the crowd like a shark through water, smooth, powerful, dangerous. Yet she noticed he kept glancing her direction, as if checking she hadn't fled, as if her presence somehow mattered beyond professional obligation. Then it happened. Near a breathtaking ice sculpture, Stephen's peers converged around her like wolves. Among them, Lyra, promoted from executive assistant to senior project manager before Natalie's arrival, a move Natalie suspected was designed to distance Lyra from her role intercepting correspondence. Lyra's sharp eyes held thinly veiled disdain. And who is this Stephen? She purred, gaze raking over Natalie dismissively, taking in the off-the-rack dress, simple shoes, lack of jewelry. One of your new projects? I heard you've been dabbling in philanthropy, darling. How delightfully noble. Or is this expensive slumming? Her words, cloaked in sophisticated politeness, were designed to sting. The small group chuckled, eyes dissecting Natalie. A venture capitalist named Sterling, silver-haired with a face that had forgotten genuine smiles, chimed in, she looks familiar. Didn't you work for that little company, Brunson and Sons? Before Stephen's brilliance paved over it, of course. Snide emphasis on paved over. Laughter grew. They weren't just humiliating Natalie, they were mocking Stephen's current atonement. Natalie felt familiar flush of shame and anger rise like bile. She braced for Stephen to join in, subtly distance himself, reassert his position. She knew this game. She prepared a biting retort. But Stephen didn't laugh. Didn't smile. His face tightened with icy fury she'd never seen except toward corporate rivals. He stepped forward, placing himself physically between Natalie and the sneering group, presence radiating palpable menace that made several people step back. "Lyra. Sterling. I suggest you reconsider your words very carefully." His voice was low, lethal, cutting through laughter like a knife. His eyes burned with unfamiliar, primal fire. "Ms. Brunson is an invaluable asset to this corporation and to me personally. Any disrespect shown to her is direct insult to Brooks Corporation and to myself." He paused, letting silence stretch. "And as for paving over, perhaps it's time we start laying new foundations, rather than celebrating demolition of the past. Perhaps it's time we ask what we've actually built, and who we've crushed in the building." The words hung heavy with unspoken weight and barely contained rage. Smiles vanished. Lyra paled, composure cracking like thin ice. Sterling looked genuinely shocked. They understood something fundamental had shifted. Stephen wasn't just defending Natalie, he was defending a nascent, vulnerable part of himself. Publicly disavowing the very ruthlessness they admired, the cutthroat mentality that had once defined him. He offered Natalie his hand, touch surprisingly gentle. "Are you all right?" She looked at his face, at raw emotion flickering in his eyes like flames behind glass, and for the first time, a hairline crack appeared in her hatred's armor. He hadn't just spoken defense, he'd stood for her, physically and socially. Sacrificed his carefully cultivated image, shocked the elite circle sustaining his power, risked standing among people whose approval had once been everything. In that moment, Natalie saw not the monster who destroyed her father, but a glimpse of the man struggling to emerge from wreckage, capable of defending something beyond his own empire and ego. But leaving intense silence, the town car gliding through rain-slicked streets reflecting city lights like fractured mirrors, Natalie couldn't shake a troubling thought. Defending her wasn't undoing what he'd done. Words at a party, however fierce, couldn't resurrect her father. Couldn't give back years spent in grief and struggle. She wasn't sure if she could ever truly separate the man trying to change from the man who'd caused irreparable harm. The two were bound together, inseparable, like light and shadow. The night after the gala, profound silence settled over Stephen's penthouse, heavier than usual. The confrontation had drained him, leaving not the usual rush of power but a weary ache penetrating his bones. He knew his public defense of Natalie had sent ripples through his inner circle, signaling weakness, perhaps the beginning of his decline. But the cost to his reputation felt insignificant compared to the quiet warmth of Natalie's surprised gratitude, a flicker he'd glimpsed before she disappeared into the night. He paced his vast living room, city lights below reduced to a blur. Sleep, still cruel stranger after months of insomnia, continued eluding him. His mind, usually a fortress of logical thought, was a battleground of conflicting emotions. He yearned for oblivion, but every time he closed his eyes he saw them, Natalie's father, then Natalie herself, faces etched with truth he tried so long to ignore. A soft knock startled him. Past midnight. He wasn't expecting anyone. He opened the door to find Natalie, still in her black dress, holding a thermos and paper cups from a late-night coffee shop. Steam rose in the cool air. "I saw your lights were on," she said softly, almost tentative. "Perhaps you'd like some tea. Real tea, not corporate swill." The gesture, stopping for tea, then returning, spoke volumes. An olive branch, tentative and fragile. Stephen stared, genuinely surprised into silence. No one, not in years, had offered such simple, unsolicited kindness. "Natalie, you don't have to do this." "No, I don't. But you defended me tonight. That was unexpected. And I think we both know you're not sleeping." She poured tea, steam rising between them. The small domestic act felt utterly alien in his sterile environment, yet strangely comforting. Stephen sank onto his sofa, accepting the cup. Warmth seeped into his trembling hands, hands that had signed documents worth billions but now shook like a child's. He felt unprecedented urge to confess. The carefully constructed facade he'd maintained for decades felt suddenly fragile, full of cracks. "I can't sleep, Natalie," he admitted, words spilling out raw and unfiltered. "Not since the diner. Your words, they're a constant loop. I see things that aren't there. I hear my father's voice, your father's voice. I don't know how to make it stop. His voice was a cracked whisper, devoid of authority, filled with desperate plea. She sat beside him, not too close, but not distant either. I know. My father couldn't sleep either, towards the end. Not until he'd tried everything, fought every battle. The guilt, the fear, the sense of failure, it consumes you from the inside out. He looked at her, eyes bloodshot and exhausted. Dark circles shadowed his face like bruises. I found your letter, Natalie. The one you sent 3 years ago, asking for dignity for your father. His voice broke. Lyra intercepted it. Sent it to Eric. I never saw it. I never knew you'd reached out. Natalie's face softened, understanding replacing usual guardedness. You never knew? Her voice held painful surprise, a sudden shift in her long-held narrative of his unmitigated cruelty. No, he whispered, shaking his head. I gave the order to acquire. I gave them power. But I created the machine, Natalie. Set it in motion. Built a culture where people like Eric and Lyra felt empowered to be cruel in my name. He looked at her desperately. That I didn't see the specific horrors, that's a coward's defense. I'm responsible for all of it. She was quiet, staring into her cup. The honesty of his self-condemnation surprised her. You're right, she said finally. It doesn't absolve you. Building the machine is worse than operating it. But at least you're not hiding from it anymore. I'm sorry, Natalie. Truly, deeply sorry. But I know sorry isn't enough. Sorry is just a word. It doesn't bring him back. Doesn't give you back the years you lost, the father you needed, the person you were before my empire crushed yours. A tear slid down Natalie's cheek, surprising them both. No, she whispered. It doesn't. And I don't know if I can ever forgive you completely. Part of me will always hate you for what you took from me. Her honesty, brutal and clean, cut deeper than any accusation. But there was something else in her eyes now, not forgiveness, which seemed impossibly far, but perhaps the faintest possibility of understanding. Recognition that he was, despite everything, human. Capable of remorse. Capable of change, even if that change came too late. They sat together in darkness, two broken people bound by irreparable past, drinking lukewarm tea in silence as the city hummed its indifferent lullaby far below. In that shared silence, something shifted, not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but perhaps the first fragile recognition that they were both drowning, and sometimes drowning people reach for each other, even across chasms of pain. The news reverberated through the financial world like a seismic shockwave, dominating headlines and trading floor conversations. Brooks Corporation was divesting its entire holdings in the urban renewal division. This wasn't merely selling assets or restructuring for efficiency. It was dismantling a significant, highly profitable arm of the empire, the very division that had, under Stephen's previous directives, acquired and raised countless small businesses for massive corporate developments. The legacy of paving over Sterling had so crudely referenced. The cost was staggering, almost incomprehensible. Billions, not just in lost future revenue, but in severance packages for displaced employees, cancelled contracts with penalty clauses, and the massive hit to the company's stock value as investors fled what they perceived as a sinking ship. Stephen's board was in an uproar, their usual composure shattered during an emergency meeting called at dawn. "Stephen, this is commercial suicide," bellowed Aldrich, a veteran board member with decades of loyalty to the Brooks name, his voice shaking with rage and something that might have been betrayal. "This division is a cornerstone of our quarterly profits. You're throwing away years of strategic growth for what? Sentiment? Guilt?" "For integrity, Aldrich," Stephen countered, his voice calm but resonating with iron resolve that silenced the room. He stood at the head of the polished mahogany table, his posture erect despite exhaustion etched into his face, his eyes clearer than they'd been in weeks, the result of a few precious hours of fitful sleep, perhaps due to the quiet tentative understanding forming with Natalie. He had spent weeks working closely with Natalie, poring over the details of urban renewal projects in ways he'd never bothered to before. She had shown him, with quiet dignity and unwavering passion that burned like a steady flame, the human cost hidden beneath profit margins, the displacement of families who'd lived in neighborhoods for generations, the destruction of community hubs that had been gathering places for decades, the systematic erosion of local economies that left people with nowhere to belong. She didn't preach or lecture, she simply laid out the facts with devastating clarity, highlighting the real-world impact on people exactly like her father. He saw faces in photographs she'd collected, read personal stories she'd documented, listened to recorded testimonies from people whose lives had been appended. The abstract figures on his spreadsheets, numbers that had once meant nothing more than profit and loss, finally transformed into vivid, heartbreaking realities he could no longer ignore or rationalize away. This division, while profitable in the short term, operates on a model that systematically undervalues and displaces existing communities for corporate gain, Stephen continued, his gaze sweeping across the stunned faces of board members he'd worked with for years. It is not sustainable, either financially or ethically. We will reevaluate our entire approach to urban development, focusing on partnership and genuine community upliftment, not hostile acquisition and demolition. His words were met with stunned silence. They couldn't believe it. This wasn't the Stephen Brooks they knew, the man who had preached profit maximization above all else. This was a man willing to sacrifice his legacy, his billions, and potentially his control over the company for a moral principle that made no sense in their world. Several board members threatened immediate resignation. Some whispered openly about calling for a vote of no confidence. The trust he had meticulously built over decades, the unwavering belief in his infallible judgment, was shattering around him like glass. But Stephen didn't flinch, didn't back down, didn't try to placate them. He looked at the chaos he had unleashed with profound clarity. This wasn't about saving face, it was about truly atoning. To dismantle the part of his empire that had caused such widespread pain was to finally sever the ties to the man he had been, the man who had crushed Natalie's father without a second thought. The vote of no confidence came within a week. Stephen survived it, but barely, clinging to his position by 3 votes out of 15. His authority was neutered, every future decision now subject to board approval. He had burned down a significant portion of his own empire, and the flames had consumed much of his power along with it. The financial press had a field day, Brooks Corporation in crisis. Billionaire's conscience costs shareholders billions. Stephen's personal wealth took a massive hit as the stock plummeted, wiping out hundreds of millions in paper value. But when he saw Natalie's face the next day, when she quietly entered his office and simply said, "Thank you for trying," with tears in her eyes she didn't bother to hide, he felt something he hadn't experienced in decades, a strange, painful hope that perhaps, in the ashes of what he destroyed, something worth building might eventually grow. 6 months had passed since the divestment. Brooks Corporation, leaner and humbler, had redirected its resources. The Community Redevelopment Initiative was no longer a token gesture but genuine effort, investing in local businesses, creating affordable housing, partnering with communities rather than bulldozing them. Natalie had become its de facto leader, her passion and integrity breathing life into what could have been corporate whitewash. Julian's condition had stabilized, experimental treatments showing remarkable progress. He'd returned to sketching with renewed vigor. One drawing, a delicate suspension bridge spanning a vast chasm, cables glinting like threads of hope, sat framed on Stephen's desk, a gift with a note, for trying to rebuild. Stephen had changed undeniably. The ruthless titan replaced by someone quieter, more thoughtful, perpetually exhausted but determined. He slept sometimes, though never deeply. The ghosts lurked in his dreams' margins, but they no longer screamed. They whispered, reminded him. He was grateful for that. On a cold December evening, 9 months after the diner, Natalie found herself in Stephen's penthouse again. He'd invited her for dinner, just dinner. She'd almost declined, but something in his voice, a fragile hope, made her accept. They sat across from each other, city sprawling below like stars. The meal was simple, prepared by Stephen himself, awkward, endearing gesture. Pasta slightly overcooked, sauce too salty, but Natalie smiled at the imperfection, the humanity it represented. "I wanted to show you something," Stephen said quietly, voice carrying unfamiliar nervousness. He retrieved a folder, hands shaking as he handed it over. Inside, legal documents. The deed to property in her father's old neighborhood, zoned for light manufacturing. Attached was Julian's rendering showing a modest, beautiful facility designed with natural light and open workspaces. A place where people could build things with their hands. It's not Brunson and Sons. Can never be that. But when Julian's well enough, if he wanted to build something, it's there. In your father's name. Natalie stared at papers, vision blurring. The rendering showed a bronze plaque, Brunson Community Workshop, in memory of a man who built with his hands and his heart. Stephen. I can't bring him back, Stephen continued, tears streaming down his face now. Can't undo what I did. But none of it changes that I destroyed the one person who believed you were worth more than. He couldn't finish. Didn't need to. Natalie set papers down carefully, hands trembling. She looked at him, really looked. The exhaustion carved into his face. The permanent shadow of guilt in his eyes. The way his hands shook. He'd sacrificed billions, reputation, power. Genuinely tried to change. I forgive you, she said quietly. Hope flared in his eyes. But Stephen, she continued, voice breaking, my father is still gone. The hope flickered but didn't die. Every morning, I remember he died believing he was a failure. You've changed. You've tried. You've given more than I thought possible. Tears slid down her cheeks. But he's still gone. He never got to see this. Never got to know his daughter would carry on his legacy. And part of me will always be that girl who lost the only person who believed in her. Stephen's face crumpled. He nodded slowly, understanding, forgiveness was not absolution. Atonement was not resurrection. He could spend his life building bridges, funding initiatives, dismantling his former cruelty, and the man he destroyed would still be dead. I know, he whispered, tears falling freely. I can't give you back your father. But can I still try? Not to earn forgiveness, some things can't be forgiven. Not to erase what I did, that's impossible. But to honor him? To make sure what happened to your father doesn't happen to anyone else. Natalie reached across the table, taking his hand. Tentative, fragile, not romantic, but achingly human. Yes. You can try. We can try together. But this doesn't erase what happened. My forgiveness doesn't bring him back. Some wounds never close. I know, he whispered, and she believed him. Outside, first snow began falling, soft and silent, covering the city. Inside, two broken people held hands, mourning what could never be recovered, tentatively building something new from ashes. Stephen would never sleep peacefully. The ghosts would always be there. But perhaps in the trying, in endless work of rebuilding, he might find something resembling peace. Not happiness. Not redemption. But purpose. The painful, necessary purpose of carrying his sin's weight while still moving forward. And sometimes, Natalie thought, looking at Julian's bridge drawing, that's all anyone can do. Carry the weight. Bear the scars. Try every day to build bridges that don't break, even knowing some chasms are too wide, some losses too profound to ever truly bridge. It wasn't a happy ending. It was simply what remained. And what remained was the hard, honest work of living with irreparable loss while still choosing to hope. He gave up everything. Billions. Power. His empire. And her father was still gone. This isn't a story about revenge. It's about something far more painful, what happens when sorry will never be enough. Stephen Brooks crushed a good man to build his empire. When Natalie delivered the sentence that shattered him, I lost the only person who believed I was worth more than the dirt on your shoes, he thought atonement was possible. He was wrong. He dismantled his company. Sacrificed his fortune. Faced public humiliation. Built a memorial in her father's name. And Natalie forgave him. But forgiveness didn't bring her father back. This is the brutal, beautiful truth. Some sins can't be undone. Some losses are permanent. And the only path forward is carrying the weight while building bridges that honor what was destroyed. If you believe in stories where redemption is earned, not given, where forgiveness exists alongside permanent grief, where love for a dying brother can make you work beside the man who destroyed your world, subscribe to get new stories every day. Because this isn't about happy endings. It's about what remains when everything's been burned down, and whether hope can grow in the ashes. The weight never gets lighter. But maybe together, we learn to carry it.